Let's talk some college football. I'm excited. End of August, first full weekend ahead. I'm going to do some predictions, but I'll just be completely honest with you. College football is entirely different than looking at the NFL or NBA for obvious reasons. NBA, you kind of know the vibe of a team. Do they have one of the top 5 players? Do they have any of the top 10 players? You can write off the teams that don't have it. NFL quarterbacks, some of the carryover, despite the ups and downs. But there's so much turnover now in college football, really even more so now than ever before. We can look at talent. We can look at recruiting rankings. We can look at the transfer stuff, the coaches we like, we don't like. But for the most part, when you read a ton of college previews, and I used to read everything, and then I had this epiphany where I go, dude, everything is overwhelmingly positive. Every new coordinator is a solution to the previous problem. And that just doesn't, the math does not work out that everybody is now better situated than they were the previous year through all these different changes. So sometimes I can get a little too caught up and be like, is anybody worried about their team? And there will be teams where we'll see a few weeks into the season, we go, okay, this unit's a huge problem. Their O-line isn't good. They don't get any pressure with the D-line. The receivers don't get any separation. This quarterback hasn't figured it out yet. But in college football, because it is so new each year, and it's why in the past, whenever you looked at the preseason rankings, you were like, did you win your bowl game as the quarterback back? Okay, you're 12th in the country. I mean, that's as simple as it was for a lot of this stuff. So I'm not providing you an alternative that's a better model and trying to figure this stuff out. I'm just saying it's more unknown and even more so now than we've ever dealt with in years past. So if we look at what everyone is saying and look at the talent dispersed throughout college football, it's pretty clear that everybody feels like Ohio State's the most talented team in the country. And I'm not going to argue that. One of the biggest stories with this offseason with Ohio State is how much money they've raised through their collectives. ESPN.com has this piece up where you talk about the transfer portal, all the money they brought in. And ultimately, it feels very political, right? Because Michigan wins a title, and Michigan's won the last 3 times they faced each other. Ohio State fans are so pissed off, and not just fans, people involved with the team, administrators, university, the coaching staff, all the collectives, like, enough of this. It's like hating somebody in power so much that you cut a check to the other candidate. That's what it feels like. There are 2 quotes that I thought were really interesting. The first from Tyvis Powell, who was part of the 2014 national championship team, who's part of one of the collectives, said, quote, "This was the first year that people were very generous donating money to collectives." Again, just the concept that you're buying the sweatshirts, you're going to the games, you're paying for parking, you're buying whatever package to watch the games that you can't go to. And then you're like, I hate Michigan so much. Here's $75. I'm not sending it to my grandkid for his birthday. The second quote from someone else involved said, quote, "Money began pouring in from small donors as well." Again, hating the opponent so much that you're willing to cut a check. So, however cynical you may be about the motivations of athletes, and certainly with college, probably becoming more cynical with everything, I think it's a real thing to be on this Ohio State roster and be one of the older players that's never beaten Michigan. I still believe in something like that it bothers. Imagine going to Ohio State and saying, well, I guess I'm just going to leave, having never beaten Michigan. I think that's a tough hang when you come back for alumni weekend. And I think there's 6 guys that were projected to be first or second round picks that decided to come back. And we could talk about the money part of it being available, and I'm not dismissing it, but I'd like to believe that it matters enough to this group of players that are older on this roster that they didn't want to leave Columbus without ever beating the Wolverines. So I think that's kind of a cool thing here. The next part of this storyline for Ohio State is Will Howard, the transfer from K-State. I know what you've read. I've read the same stuff, that he was going to lose his job to Avery Johnson at Kansas State anyway, and that's why he transferred. So if you want to be a little harsh on it, and you're going, okay, well, this is your transfer, and he was going to lose his job in the Big 12. But look, he doesn't throw a lot of picks. He's massive, and if you want to use him in the run game, he's just a bull out there. And if he takes care of the football with this talent and the way the schedule works out, it's kind of one of those don't screw it up moments, but you're going to need him to be a little bit more aggressive than probably some of the times you felt like Ohio State just couldn't complete those 3rd and longs against the better football teams last year. If you look at the Big Ten with Ohio State, for however many years you want to go back and do this exercise, the problem that I always had in comparing them to, say, the other top teams from the SEC is I just felt like 11 out of 12 games, it's automatic that the talent gap is massive between whoever Ohio State, who they are and whoever they're playing, right? Other than obviously Michigan the last couple of years. And I'd say even like 2 years ago, I thought Ohio State was more talented. Didn't work out. All right, doesn't matter. But I think in those other 11 games, like, this is significant whenever you watch them play. And it wasn't the same challenge as another title contender in the SEC. So with expansion, I think the first thing to do is go, okay, well, now the Big Ten is going to be that much tougher, which it should be when you bring in these 4 teams from out west. But if you look at the way Ohio State's schedule actually breaks, the non-conference is Akron, Western Michigan, Marshall. They've got to visit out to Eugene on October 12th. But if you look at their schedule and they finish with Michigan at home, Ohio State traditionally has always been really good at playing one of the other big boys in their non-conference. It kind of feels like the same thing. So even with the expansion and then Michigan at home, just look at Oregon as a non-conference game, even though it is now one of the 9. It's not as daunting as some of this other stuff that you're seeing with schools in the expansion of the 2 major conferences in the Big Ten and the SEC. So, look, I think they win the conference, but I'm not sure I'm going to pick them to win the national championship. We take a look at the SEC in the preseason rankings. They have 4 of the top 6 teams in the country. They have 7 of the top 15. They finished last year, if you include Texas, which can be a little misleading because there would just be more losses in there if they were in the conference. Not necessarily Texas, but you understand the point, right? With 6 of the top 12. So how many teams are they actually going to get in here? So if you look at 7 of the top 15, maybe Tennessee is going to be really good as well. I've read about Nico Iamaleava probably 20 times just this offseason. We'll see. So will they get 4? This is where the preseason rankings can mess things up a bit with the preconceived notions that we have with teams. We don't really have anything else to go on. I remember there was this one voter years ago where he was trying his hardest to just say, I bring nothing to the table. I start a clean slate every single week. I don't want to assume anything about any teams, but it's actually an impossible exercise because if you had a team that was unranked in the preseason rankings, beating a good team in week 1, and then you go, okay, I'm starting from scratch and I'm just going to put them way at the top. It's like, okay, but you are also still guilty of believing the team that they beat based on the preseason rankings was an incredible win, and that may not be the case. So I don't know if we're going to have 2 of these SEC teams be disasters. Are they all going to be really good and they only pick each other off once and it all kind of balances out and you end up with a bunch of these teams with really good records? It may take us until November until we find out like 1 or 2 of these teams just isn't even close and should have never been ranked this high. But in those first few weeks, if somebody's beating one of these other teams in the top 15 preseason ranking, we're going to think that it's actually a good win. If you look at last year's rankings, teams number 8 through number 12 were all 2-loss teams, including number 12, Oklahoma, but Liberty would have been the number 12 in the playoff seeding with this year's model. So if you're looking at a 3-loss SEC team, you go, do they get in? Do they get the benefit of the doubt? And I'm going to get to that when I talk about the Big 12 a little bit later. But if you go back 2 years ago, Utah at number 8, K-State at number 9, both had 3 losses. But granted, they were both conference champs, so not at large. But if you go through the rankings for other years, there's going to be 3 losses. That could happen this year. There's going to be a 3-loss team that gets the at-large bid before that number 12 spot. When I look at Bama for DeBoer, it would have been bad enough if they were to miss the playoff in the old format. If he doesn't make it in the 12-team format post-Saban, it's just going to be – they could still be a decent team, but you just know how it's going to go down there in Tuscaloosa because it's going to be a feeling they haven't felt in a really long time. Notre Dame, just a quick aside on them. I love Riley Leonard when he's healthy. We know that he's a baller. I think they get too much criticism overall as a program because they come in at preseason number 7. Some of the stuff just, it's so repetitive. Like, why do you give a shit they don't play in a conference? Who cares? They've been preseason top 13 6 straight years. And I've seen it where it's like, oh, here we go again. Everybody likes Notre Dame. Well, if you look at where they finished in the 6 years they've been ranked in the top 13 in the preseason, they have finished in the top 15 4 years. They finished number 3, number 4, number 5. They had final rankings at number 21 and number 16 in the last 2 years. That's not great, but it's not this massive disappointment. It's because you can label Notre Dame as different. They catch more shit for it. Losing in a playoff game and getting smoked, there's this lingering feeling like, oh, these guys again. When in reality, they're kind of holding up better, I think, than people give them credit. The ACC, I have no idea. I know everybody liked Florida State. They were the betting favorite before the season started. They lose to Georgia Tech. We all watched on Saturday. I do love Haynes King for Georgia Tech. I know he didn't light it up statistically. I just think he's really tough going back to when he was at A&M. But clearly Florida State in this new version of things is still in it at number 10 in the preseason, and then we'll see where that goes because they didn't update the rankings until after this weekend. Clemson's at 14, Miami's at 19, and then NC State with Grayson McCall threw for over 10,000 yards and 88 touchdowns with Coastal Carolina and a top 30 opponent scoring defense. NC State getting a lot of love there too. But I feel like I'm leaning maybe finally to Miami figuring this thing out with Cam Ward. All right, the Big 12. Utah is also the betting favorite here. Number 12 in the preseason. They're tough to go against with Rising and Keithy both healthy. And if they're both healthy and they run through this, well, I don't mean run through because I think the Big 12 is going to be really competitive, but they end up there at the end. I don't think that's going to be really surprising because those guys have been studs when they can actually play. If you go back to previous seasons, they would have been in this playoff in this format in 2019, 21, and 22. K-State's getting a lot of love. Not the favorites, but close in the betting numbers. Number 19 in the preseason. Avery Johnson, who we've already mentioned, and the tailbacks, but they've got new receivers and they're replacing a bunch of guys in the O-line. But their schedule, if you look at it, really lines up for them much better to maybe even be alive if they can't beat out Utah to still put together a really nice season because they have Arizona, Oklahoma State, and Kansas at home, and they don't play Utah in the regular season. Oklahoma State's in a bowl game every year because they're in a bowl game every year, going all the way back to 2005. The schedule's tough early, 4 or 5 game stretch here where it's against Arkansas, Utah, at Kansas State, and then versus West Virginia, all by October 5th. My favorite Big 12 team, though, is Arizona. Fafita to McMillan is also my favorite QB wide receiver combination in college football. McMillan's the best receiver, I think, in college. And I remember last year, September 30th, the game against Washington. I'm back in a hotel room. I'm watching it. And I'm left with the what's wrong with Washington question, which was totally wrong and misguided because nothing's wrong with Washington. It's just that Arizona is good. And we started to see that as they continue to rip off a bunch of wins the rest of the regular season. I love their game against SC. And in that game, Caleb Williams has one of my favorite incompletions ever. Not like there weren't other Caleb Williams throws where I was like, this guy's going to be really good. But that one incompletion in particular, I was like, I can't believe he even made that throw. Anyway, moving on. The story of McMillan and Fafita is incredible because I don't know how much you know about this. Locals will know. Arizona people will know. But they've known each other since 8th grade. McMillan was supposed to go to Oregon, and then Cristobal left. So they both went to high school together in California, and there's a few other players on this Arizona roster as well. Jed Fish leaves for Washington. And then collectively, this group that all went to high school together decided to stay at Arizona. But there's another part of the story that I didn't know about. The new head coach, Brett Brennan, was a grad assistant at Hawaii in 1998 with a guy named Troy Thomas, who was the high school coach of Fafita McMillan and the others back in California. So he called. They all vouched for each other, and they got to keep all their dudes. Will they be in the playoffs? Before I get to the playoff thing, one thing that I want to mention that I'm going to miss the Big Ten West. I'm going to miss a fan base every year because they've won games and maybe win the division, pretending that they're good. And it's just what happens sometimes with divisions, but this division was bad for a really long time. I know Iowa 10 years ago ended up being better than I thought. I know Northwestern had a couple nice finishes with the final rankings. But if you go through the 10 years, the 10 straight years, the West lost the Big Ten championship game to the other side. Because again, that's 10 straight years without ever winning the conference championship game. They are outscored 352 to 145. I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss a fan base, and I don't even mean one in particular, but I'm going to miss fan bases from that side of the Big Ten because we don't have it anymore. Knowing their team really isn't that good, but then pretending and then arguing a break here, a break there, like, are we national title contenders? Like, probably not. Look at all the defenses. That's one way of looking at it. All right, so prediction time. Ohio State, Big Ten, Georgia, SEC, Utah, Big 12, Miami, ACC. What's the first criticism whenever you say anything nice about Miami? Well, they never figure it out. They have to at some point, don't they? Maybe Clemson's the team. I don't know what to do with them either. Maybe writing off Florida State is a mistake, and I'm not necessarily writing them off, but I don't have them in the playoffs, so that feels like I'm writing them off, and maybe I wouldn't have done that 2 weeks ago. The at-large bids, Oregon, Texas, Penn State. A note on Penn State, and I know Penn State fans, you've heard it before, but if you guys are 11-1, not playing Michigan this year, and you get killed by Ohio State, now maybe Wisconsin's good, maybe USC's good, USC's ranked. Maybe there'll be a couple nice wins. But if Wisconsin isn't good and USC isn't any good, you don't play Michigan and Ohio State kills you and you're 11-1 and you're like, well, look out, title. we get a chance, I will criticize it. All right. Notre Dame I have in. I have Ole Miss in. I like Jackson Dart as much as any quarterback not named Carson Beck in the SEC. I put Clemson in, and I try to figure out a way to put Arizona in before I get to Boise State. But if you go through the exercise, if Arizona's down in this neighborhood, they're 10-2. So that would be, say they lost to Utah and Kansas State. All right, well, that's not great because they lost to the two favorites. Now, where are the other wins? If you look at them versus, say, a Bama 10-2 season, say Bama, and I'm just going in order. I'm not doing it because of matchups or anything. If you look at the ranked teams as of now, and this will change, but if Bama were to lose to Georgia and Tennessee, but then also has wins against Missouri, LSU, and Oklahoma, there's no way. There's no way a Big 12 team with that profile gets in over a Bama team that's 10-2. So I put down Bama as the final at-large. I'm not going to run through every single matchup, and this team beats this team, and these guys advance, and they have the bye. I have Oregon winning the national championship. Why not?